Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now adding movement to your haunt is a great way to make it more interesting or even interactive. But figuring out how to tackle building your own can be overwhelming. But don't worry, because in this video marathon I've gathered 5 of my favorite motorized prop builds that should help to demystify the process and get you on your way to a more high-tech haunt. So let's get into it. Now adding a bit of motion to an otherwise static display can be a real game changer, but it doesn't have to be difficult. So in this video I'm going to show you how to make a simple pop-up mechanism with just a few tools. So let's get to it. Before we get into the build, let's take a quick look at some of the parts we'll be using. All of the wood pieces are 1x3s cut at 17, 14, 8, and 4 inches, as well as a synchronous motor and 3 nylon patio door rollers. The motor can hang out for a bit while I build the main structure of this mechanism, starting with installing the rollers. The rollers are designed to hold a vertical rod in place and allow it to slide up and down. So I've drilled 3 holes roughly a ½ inch from the edge of the board and spaced a few inches apart to mount my rollers. I'm attaching the rollers with a 2-inch screw as well as 5 washers that are acting as spacers so that there's room for the hardware that will be attached to our push rod, which I'll be getting into a little later in the build. This location and spacing of your rollers will depend on what width and length of material you use, but you want them spaced out so that whatever you use for the push rod will fit between them and can move freely. Speaking of the push rod, I grabbed some 1/2-inch flat stock aluminum and cut it into 3 pieces: 3½ inches, 5 inches, and 15 inches. They're held together with a screw, 3 washers, and a lock nut, with the washers placed between each surface to keep them from binding up. Now that the push rod is assembled, we can move on to attaching the base for our mechanism. Rather than measure, I like to use the parts to determine their placement and then mark it out with a marker. The same goes for screws. These are just barely sticking out, and I'll use them to mark the location where I'll drill the matching holes, since this lumber is prone to splitting. With the first piece attached, I'll add on the last piece that will make up the foot of our mechanism. However, this time, I'll be using pocket holes to join them. The last piece to add is the motor mount. I've attached the motor to the 4-inch piece of wood and will use it to help determine its final placement. But first I need to attach the push rod. Having this all assembled will help me to make sure that everything fits correctly before I make anything permanent. So I'll thread the push rod between the roller wheels and then mark where the motor mount should go, and we'll pre-drill and screw it in place with some 2-inch screws. The last thing to do is to connect the motor to power. So off camera, I stripped the ends of a power cord and connected it to the motor wires with some wire nuts. Now I just need to plug it in. 5 years ago, I posted a video to this channel about my rocking shovel prop. And while it definitely is a fan favorite to the people that visit our cemetery, it wasn't exactly how I imagined it would be. So 5 years later and many weekly videos in, I thought now's as good a time as any to revisit it and maybe see if we could make it more like I had imagined it would be in the beginning. So let's get to it. The first thing you'll notice from this old video is that it's moving pretty slowly, and that the motor's struggling to pull it back from its furthest position, since it's just a small synchronous or reindeer motor. Also, because of how underpowered it was, I wasn't able to hang the lantern off the shovel handle as I'd originally imagined this would work, and instead ended up having to rest it on the tree stump. Which is fine, but it's not what I'd hoped for. As we get closer, you can see that the push rod is connected to the shovel with a really bulky bracket that I'd made. And if you were looking from the side, you'd absolutely be able to see it. And that's no good. The door hinge on the bottom is still a great solution for the pivot point, so I won't have to worry about that. All in all, there's definitely some areas where this can be improved, so let's improve it. As you can see here, the motion is much more smooth. The shovel mount is much smaller, and most importantly, the lantern is hanging from the shovel handle. But let's take a closer look at how this is different from my first version. To start off, I swapped out the underpowered motor for a windshield wiper motor. This motor has a lot more torque and can handle the weight of the shovel and the lantern without any signs of struggle. It's mounted to a small platform using a Simpson tie that I got from the fencing department of my local hardware store. The mechanism is mostly the same as the original, with a 3-inch piece of flat stock aluminum connected to the motor and an 8-inch threaded rod with female heim joints, sometimes called rod end bearings, on either end connecting the aluminum bar and motor to the shovel. The heim joint allows for 2 misaligned objects to move smoothly without binding. I chose to use them because they're really forgiving when trying to move objects that may be slightly out of alignment from one another. You'll also notice that I changed how the shovel connects to the motor. This is just a piece of 1/2-inch flat stock aluminum that I've bent at a 90-degree angle and then twisted one end to align with the rod. It's a more low-profile method that's harder to see. A new addition to this prop is the use of a motor speed control. This allows me a way to really dial in the speed of the motor, which is really important with wiper motors since they run at much faster RPMs than you'd want for most prop applications. The final new addition is the handle-mounted lantern. The lantern is wired to a standard light socket, and its cord is held in place along the back side of the handle and lantern with a bit of hot glue and floral wire, so that it disappears under haunt lighting. As you can see, having the lantern hung over the shovel handle provides a greater overall movement that's more eye-catching, especially since this prop randomly turns on and off via Arduino. This is a relatively easy way to have a moving light source that will really draw the attention of your visitors and give your display a much more dynamic look. Now, one of the first uploads I made to this channel was of a rocking tombstone mechanism, and after many years of being in our haunt, I think it's about time for some upgrades. So let's get to it. So here's where it started nearly 7 years ago. And here's what it's looked like in the haunt with the foam surround and tombstone attached. And here's what it looks like today. A small synchronous motor, and a series of aluminum bars and brackets. It's a little rough around the edges, but definitely serviceable. So let's get to disassembly. With everything disassembled, I want to reposition the motor and turn it 90 degrees. This will allow me to reconfigure the aluminum bar and keep it from sticking out the back side of the base. So with a flathead screwdriver in hand, I pried the mount off of the base. The mount took a bit of the MDF base with it, but I'll sand it flat before reassembly. With the motor mount turned, I can shift my focus to determining the length of the aluminum push rod that will make the Tombstone rock back and forth. This takes a bit of trial and error, but with the motor turned to its lowest point, I can eyeball where the push rod will attach to the upper platform and then cut the aluminum bar down to size. I'll also take this opportunity to put a bend in the push rod. This will allow me to mount it beneath the platform rather than on the side and in perfect alignment with the motor shaft. And since I'm here, I'll add a mounting hole, followed by a small chamfer with a step-up bit. This helps to keep everything nice and tidy. Now I can focus on how the rod will connect to the platform, starting with some small 1-inch L brackets. Once the brackets are installed, I can add in a screw, some washers, and a lock nut to keep it in place and then connect it to the motor. I'll also use a few self-tapping screws to reattach the motor to the motor mount. And with everything connected, I can adjust all of the parts until they're perfectly aligned and then glue the motor mount in place with a bit of CA glue. And just to make sure that I have a strong bond, I added in a bit of baking soda to the glue. This helps to set the glue, but also is a great way to add some bulk to the joint for extra stability and to fill in any gaps between the mount and the base. All that's left to do is to brush away the excess, and it's time to test it out.
Now, as someone who makes things for a living, I tend to have a lot of odds and ends floating around my shop that I'm holding on to for a rainy day. And in this video, I'm going to take some of those parts and turn them into a basic Halloween animatronic. So let's get to it.
The first thing I needed to tackle was building a base to support this motorized prop. So I grabbed some leftover molding that I've been kicking around the shop and cut it down into more manageable sizes, which I'll assemble using pocket holes and screws. You don't need to use pocket holes, but I'm really working at only using things I had laying around, and I didn't have any small L brackets, so pocket holes it is.
Off camera, I added on a small vertical piece of molding that will support my motor. I also mixed up a bit of wood glue and sawdust to use as filler for my screw holes. This should prevent them from rotting out over time from moisture. I also coated the piece with some spray-on truck bed liner and added another piece of molding to the base, but forgot to film it. So in its place, enjoy this classic dramatic reenactment. Now with the base assembled, partly coated, and the motor installed, it was time to start figuring out how to attach my skeleton. I had this threaded lamp rod from another project that I thought might fit perfectly into the spine of the skeleton, as well as this small door hinge. Together with a 1x2 block of wood should work as the fulcrum for this prop. So I drilled a hole in the block of wood that is the same size as my threaded rod and attached the hinge, and with that it was ready to be installed onto the base. But before I can mount the skeleton to the base, I was going to need a bit of spinal surgery. Thankfully, these pose and stay skeletons have screws all over the place, which makes them easy to disassemble and reconfigure. So after unscrewing the base of the spine to confirm that the threaded rod would be a good fit, I needed to do a bit of trimming to make a clear pathway for it that wasn't obstructed by the molded screw holes. A quick snip to remove the obstructions, and I could start the reassembly. I left the top screw hole intact since that would be used as a motor mounting point. But before I could screw it together, I was going to need to enlarge the opening to fit my hardware. And once that was done, it was time to close it all up. Because I wanted the shoulders to have a larger range of motion, I was going to have to modify them as well. So I popped both arms out and cut away the plastic joint. This would give me a way to connect the shoulders to the body, but still give some freedom of movement as the torso rocked side to side. And once again, I dug through my toolboxes and spare parts and found these bungee straps that have a ball on one end. And much to my surprise, they're just slightly larger than the opening in the shoulder. So I looped the bungee end around the mounting post inside the shoulder bone and tied it into a knot to hold it in place. Then I could pop the ball end into the shoulder socket. This would allow for some movement but still make for a solid connection. The last part of this build was spent figuring out how long to make each section of the motor armature. Now I'll spare you from watching me try and figure it out and instead just show you the finished linkage. It's made from 3/4 inch flat stock aluminum, which is connected to the motor, and then a 1/2 inch piece of flat stock aluminum that is connected to the skeleton, using a 3/4 inch nylon spacer, some washers, and lock nuts to keep it from coming loose. Now you could use all 3/4 inch aluminum, but hiding the mechanism is half the challenge with these types of props, so the less I needed to hide, the better. Now it's just a matter of attaching the armature and powering it up. You'll notice that I connected a speed controller to the motor, which is a must-have when using these windshield wiper motors. They have a lot of lifting power, but run at a faster RPM than most props require, even on their slow setting. I also fixed the arms in place at the wrists with some eye bolts and zip ties. Now this may change in the future, but for the time being it'll keep them in a good neutral position that should help with the look of the motion. And there we go. The skeleton is rocking, and it looks alright, but it needs something more. So I sat and observed the motion, thinking about how I might be able to improve it. The skeleton taunting me as it swayed side to side. Will I ever figure it out?
Join us next time on VanOaks Props when we'll answer the questions: will the skeleton ever stop taunting Derek? Will he figure out a way to improve its motion? Will the invisible murderer who's in every video finally strike?
They say sometimes you just need to step away from a problem in order to come up with a solution. So after a bit of time away, I'm ready to jump back in on this wilting flower prop and show you exactly how I was able to get it working. So let's get to it. After banging my head against the wall for a while, I decided to redesign the entire mechanism, starting with this brand new mounting plate. Just like my previous attempt, the small synchronous motor sits at the bottom and will be held in place with some 1/2-inch screws. I'll leave a complete list of parts and a link to my 3D model in the video description should you want to build one for yourself. Once the motor's in place, I can start adding in my sliding door rollers, which are held in place with a 2-inch bolt and a lock nut. I'll also add in a washer on either side of the roller wheel. These will act as both a stabilizer and a guide for the new push rod design. And speaking of the push rod, it's made up of the following lengths of 4mm by 1/2-inch flat stock aluminum. One piece at 4 1/4 inches, one at 2 inches, and the last piece is 1 3/4 inches. This length of the last piece may vary based on the location of the mounting hole on your motor, but the most important part is that the length from the bend to the end of the rod is 1 inch. And after a quick assembly, let's give it a test to make sure that there's no issues with the linkage. Okay, everything looks good, so let's proceed. The next thing I did was mark off the high and low points in the movement so that I knew where to cut this longer piece. This was filmed before determining the lengths I mentioned a moment ago, so there's no additional cutting once you've cut those pieces. This piece will also need to be left long enough to fit the platform, which I was able to salvage from my first attempt of this build. With the aluminum bar cut to length and inserted into the platform, it was time to add in the wires that will help to create the wilting effect. After receiving a ton of suggestions, I landed on using 5-inch pieces of clothes hanger wire, and I also cut back on the number of flowers from 10 to 5, which should put less stress on the motor. But before I can test that theory, I need to glue them all in place with a bit of CA glue and set them aside to cure. While I wait, I grab some aquarium tubing and this artificial flower and a few of its leaves to make my wilting bouquet by painting the tubes and gluing both the roses and leaves to the tubing. Once I was finished, I could glue them into the vase insert, which will eventually be set into the vase top, but more on that in a minute. As an added bit of security, I applied some extra glue to the outside of the tubing where it meets the insert. I figured the tubing will get the most wear and tear, and this connection will bear most of the force from the motor, so a little bit of extra glue seemed like a good idea. The bottom half of the motor mount is designed to match the interior shape of the vase,
So off camera, I glued it in place and ran the motor's wires out a small hole in the bottom. Now I can grab the vase top and set it into place, thread the flowers over the wires, and test everything out. After wiring my motor to an extension cord and powering it up, it looks like everything is working correctly. Now I can glue the two halves of the vase together and then give it a quick coat of paint. The final version of my model will be designed to use magnets on the lid rather than glue, just in case you need to access the mechanism for any reason. And once the paint had dried, it was time to check it out in all its wilting glory.
Now there's always ways you can improve this prop, like adding weights to the flowers to increase the wilting effect, or connect it to a prop controller to get the timing just right. But for me, I think I'll leave those for another day. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something. They say sometimes you have to step away from a problem in order. So let's get to it. That sucked.